The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spagnola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life, broadcasting since 2014. This is an episode about the 4 most useful intuitive tools I employ to plan all of my marketing, all of my business activities, and honestly, just my life in general, especially any important decisions, though. And I use these all year round for decision making, but most especially and most consistently, I use all 4 of these in the fall-winter period when I'm planning the year ahead. And then I'm refining those plans again, usually in the early new year, again, using these 4 main tools. This year, I'm hosting my 10th annual intuitive planning workshop, a half-day retreat happening online on Sunday, November 24th. And I'll tell you more about that at the end of the episode if you want details, but I know many people will already be forming the question in their mind. So yes, it will be recorded for later viewing. Absolutely. But first, before I go any further, I want to take some time to stand on ceremony here. It feels very important to me to take a moment for some deeper acknowledgement and gratitude, because this is a first on the Numinous Podcast. I'm your host, Carmen Spagnola, and for the first time, and going forward on this show, I am joining you from the unceded and ancestral lands of the Syilx-speaking people of the Okanagan First Nation, specifically the Penticton Indian Band. I'm in a rural area known as Falder, BC, population 950 or so. It's a tiny valley. It's more like what Americans would probably call a hollow. I think if you were like in the Northeast, you'd call it a hollow. If you're in like the Southeast, you'd call it a holler. It's like a small mountainside little valley. And the plot of land I'm on is about 70 acres, and maybe 15 acres of that are flat creek bottom acres. And the rest is subalpine desert, so dry hills of ponderosa pine and bunch grass and pussy toes, I think it's called, and sage grass and things like that. The nearest town, Summerland, is about 15 minutes away, population 12,000 or so. And the history of this land is that in 1861, an oral agreement was made between the High Chief of the Okanagan, whose name was Wistismet Squechun. He was also known as Chief Niquala, and so that name is now seen throughout this area like the Nicola Valley. His name translates in English to Chief Walking Grizzly Bear. And so this agreement was made between Chief Walking Grizzly Bear and the first governor of British Columbia that permitted the local indigenous people to mark off a really large informal reserve at the south end of Okanagan Lake. Now, a little bit of a sidebar, the first governor of British Columbia was Sir James Douglas. He was a fur trader for the Hudson's Bay Company, and he was a politician. And he was the chief mastermind and negotiator who wheeled and dealed and swindled to essentially create this province known as British Columbia. And in the records of the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, he's referred to as a Scotch West Indian because Douglas's father was a Scottish merchant with interests in the sugar plantations of British Guyana in South America. But his mother was a black free woman of Barbadian Creole descent. So I can imagine that initially the local indigenous people of these lands, they must have been inclined to trust this mixed race black man. And it must have made their heads spin. Like they must have been shocked at how quickly the agreements were made and then broken. And the speed with which settler colonization went from treaty negotiations and agreements to the criminalization of indigenous identity and culture, and to the genocide of indigenous peoples through the introduction of intentional smallpox epidemics throughout BC, which I will link to the book in the show notes that is proving that. The research proves that it was intentional. And then, of course, subsequently, the displacement onto reserves and the horrific abuses suffered through the residential school system. Anyway, when I put it in that context, like, what a betrayal it must have been. Anyway, okay, back to the land where I live now. So this land back then in the 1860s was surveyed according to the instruction of these local indigenous people to include areas they had an interest in, like villages and agricultural land and sacred areas and burial grounds. The area around Summerland was included in this informal reserve for the indigenous folks. The agreement wasn't a formal treaty, and it also didn't surrender First Nations ownership or resource rights to lands outside of the reserve lands. The goal was to make land available for First Nations people to support themselves and to open the rest of the land to settlement by both settlers and First Nations. So the intention was to share. Within just 4 years, the Crown broke that treaty and forced the Indigenous people onto the reserve at Penticton at the south end of Okanagan Lake, which is about half an hour from where I am, and dramatically reduced the size. And even though this area where I am lacks the animals that were really highly prized during that fur trade area, the Syilx Okanagan peoples, they were horse people. They were horse breeders and traders. So they were a critical part of the overland trade system here. Today, the Penticton Indian Band still manages the wild horse herds of this area. And one of those herds actually traverses the land where I live. When I have seen piles of horse manure on our driveway, it brings me to tears. It just feels like such a blessing. And I've had the chance, if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen my post where I said, like, my toxic trait is thinking I can walk up to this herd of wild horses and have it be okay. And actually it was okay. And until they started like really kind of mouthing my hand, and then I tried to like hide behind my car door and they started to like mouth my windshield wipers. But anyway, I have touched the wild horses of this area. Part of my commitment to supporting and amplifying Indigenous land back efforts is going to be to ensure that the wild horses of the South Okanagan continue to be protected and managed by the Syilx people. Specific individual outreach on my part is currently underway to connect with local Indigenous elders and Indigenous activists who are working with the wild horses. But you may also want to listen to my episode 226 on this podcast. It's called The Wild Horses of the Chilcotin. And my guest for that was Canada's foremost wild horse biologist, Wayne McCrory. If this kind of thing interests you, I think you'll really like that episode. So raising awareness is part of my advocacy. But like, hey, if you know someone personally involved in the protection of wild horses in southern BC, please leave me a note on castfeedback.com/numinous podcast. I'm going to link to that in this episode's show notes because like, obviously we should be friends. Yeah, I would love to connect. Anyway, I also want to share that on the land where I live, if you zoom right into the place, like where I lay my head each night, you would clearly see just like 100 feet away, cutting across the mountainside, there's an old road that bisects the property. It used to be a road anyway. Now it's more of a trail. It's like a single file walking trail. It's bigger than a game trail, but probably only big enough for like a horse to pass. It's not like a wagon trail or anything. Now, when the government was first building railways and then roads around here, they called this the Old Indian Trail. And more recently, it's referred to as the Indigenous Trail or the Fur Brigade Trail. So this trail that bisects this property, where we go for walks like among the pines, is an ancient Indigenous route, actually. This trail, parts of it have been carbon dated at 6,000 years old. It's been a transportation route for Indigenous people since time immemorial. So even though the land where I'm living has been, let's say, quite neglected for the past 50 years or so, it remains a very, very special place and a place worthy of much love and care and respect and attention. And of course, like every place can make that claim, right? Every spot on earth deserves love and care and honoring, of course. But if you could imagine someone who has been neglected or abused or like continually extracted from and disrespected for decades, with like garbage and detritus and artifacts accumulating and like strewn across the landscape, then you can imagine that this land would have pretty low self-esteem. And while of course everyone deserves love and care and honoring, we would want to extend an extra dose of care and attention to those who've been neglected or abused. Building up self-esteem takes a really long time and a lot of consistency. And restoring this land so it's cleared and capable of regenerative agriculture again, and supporting wildlife and managing climate threats like wildfire and pine beetle, all that is probably going to be work that I'll never see the end of. And it's more work than me and my husband are capable of our own, for sure. And it's more definitely than my, almost 21-year-old queer, neurodivergent, dynamically disabled child will ever be able to manage on their own. So we have plans are afoot to welcome a small group of queer and non-binary folk. We call them the they, thems, a land we got from them. So this land is zoned to have like 9 dwellings. So after my in-laws and me and Ruben and our kid occupy 3 of those dwellings, we can have 6 more dwellings for the they, thems to come and make this place our home. And I'm not sure how long it will be until it feels like we are in right relationship to this place and to its original Indigenous people. But I do know that there is a debt owed to this land, and there are reparations due to its original stewards. And my hope is that one day my child will stand before an Indigenous elder saying, I know by rights this is your land, but I'm hoping that we have been such devoted stewards of this place and allies and accomplices to you that you will allow us to stay. And if they say no, we want that land back, we would need to accept their no. And we would just have to make a plan for that, just as the Indigenous people had to make a survival plan for getting kicked off. But I'm hoping that the elder will say, yes, yes, your people, you and your parents, and the friends that you welcomed to be cohabitants with you on this parcel, you have all been good friends to us, and you can stay. That's my hope. So may it be so, and may the land and the people flourish with the arrival of this new energy, and may a blessed renewal begin of reciprocal love and care here. And before anyone gets too stressed, I'm 99% sure that the Penticton band and the Syilx Okanagan people would never ask us to leave anyway. There's much larger, much more important gains to be made reclaiming what's currently known as crown land throughout the territory. So I definitely don't want to stoke white paranoia, okay? Today's land back movement is not about displacing settlers from what we currently consider private property. However, all I'm saying is, I'm open to it. In all fairness, I'm open to it. That would align with my values. But yeah, I don't want to stoke white person fears about retribution. So if I'm freaking you out, just relax. Just bring on your arms and legs, just self-regulate. I do not speak for any part of the Indigenous land back movement. This is nothing I've ever read or seen. But I will say, my fellow skin kin, hear me when I quote Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. Decolonization is not a metaphor. So in light of that, this is how I proceed philosophically and relationally in the land where I live. So the word for thank you in Syilx, the Syilx language, is limlämt. So it's so great, right? Limlämt, that's thank you in Syilx. So limlämt to this land, thank you. Limlämt, Syilx, the Syilx people, thank you. Limlämt to the ancestors and spirits of this place, as well as the plants and rocks and animals for hosting us. Limlämt, limlämt, limlämt. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And my friends, if you ever get a chance to learn an Indigenous language, like the Indigenous language where you live, I heartily recommend it. My husband and I have taken night classes in Syilx, the language here, and it teaches so much about the culture and ways of being of the Indigenous lifeways here. If you've listened to this podcast for a long time, you know that many years ago I took Lekwungen language lessons when I lived in southern Vancouver Island. Ooh, too soon. And it taught me so much about how to be there in a good way. And if you can learn the word for thank you, you know, like not just the sound, but the concepts behind the sounds, it goes so far towards understanding how to be in relationship with the land and the people where you are. And if I have one regret about learning Lekwungen, the language of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, it's that I was always like a little embarrassed to speak the language out loud, like even just to say thank you. I always felt a bit sheepish about appearing performative. And the word for thank you in my homelands of Vancouver Island is Heichka. All up and down the island, it's Heichka. And I rarely ever said it out loud, except directly to Indigenous elders. But in the last year that I lived there, when I knew I'd be leaving soon, I said it out loud to the land and the plants and the animals directly all the time. And I wish I'd said it more in my life. And in this last year, I couldn't say it enough. Just Heichka, Heichka, Heichka. And I wish I'd said it in the language of the land 1,000,000 times more. So, my friends, don't be shy. Have no shame. Have no regret. Tell the land you love them in the language they understand. Okay. This is kind of just what happens when I just write bullet points for my script instead of typing out every word. These off the cuff episodes. I'm always crying. Anyway, okay, on to today's topic. Okay, so 4 critical intuition tools I use for decision making. I want to preface this episode by saying probably my primary decision making tool is not one that I can do myself, and that's electional astrology. So if something's really important, like selecting specific dates and times to launch a program or publish a special podcast episode or send a manuscript to my agent or set a meeting with my publisher, I consult my electional astrologer who will check the astro weather to forecast when will be the most optimum moment for that task. So if you're getting married or sending out a pitch for something or anything that you have control over like that, you want an electional astrologer. Now, for less high stakes, in the similar vein, I'll just check the general astrology of the day, either using my Chani planner, because yes, I'm a longtime Chani app lover, or I'll go to astrology.com's monthly horoscopes for just the key transits that day and what's going on. Now, on a more micro level, for my daily stuff, I will consult planetaryhours.net. And I do that to ensure I'm taking action on that day during an hour that's ruled by the planet that best supports that specific action. So sometimes I check planetary hours several times a week for scheduling and programming, especially when I'm setting programming for the Numinous Network. If I'm deciding on a start time for a special event, I'm doing a workshop on something about healing the body or disability justice or something to do with somatics, I'm going to want to check the planetary hours and try to run that workshop during a time that's ruled by the moon, which is the luminary that rules over and supports the body really well. So those kinds of things with electional astrology and checking the planetary hours, those aren't really about me doing divination. That's just seeking surplus knowledge from the cosmos beyond my skill set to determine best timing. But these 4 tools that I'm about to share are what I do when I'm making complex decisions beyond just time and date. So the first tool I'll share is the pendulum. So addictive, so fun. Pendulums are so essential to my business life and to my life in general. When people say they don't have a pendulum, it's like when somebody tells me they don't have a therapist. I'm like, but how do you live? Like, how do you do things? How do you decide stuff if you don't have a pendulum? I keep like one on my desk, one on my bedside table, one in my purse, one in the junk drawer. I have several in my collection that I keep with all my witch apothecary items. If you don't know what a pendulum is, like if you go into a new age store, you'll often see a display of pendulums on the counter hanging kind of like jewelry. But probably the original pendulum was just a needle and thread. I remember when I was a kid and my Auntie Sandy, who was like 10 years older than me, rest in peace, may her soul be well. Auntie Sandy, when she was pregnant, all my other aunties were there, the older ones, and my Auntie Karen dangled a needle and thread over Sandy's really full pregnant belly. I'm sure you've seen this before. And in our family, there'd been like a run of boys born, like for a long time, it seemed. Like there was like my mom and then her 3 younger sisters and then me. So like a good run of girls. And then there were my 2 brothers, my cousin Brent, my other cousin Troy. It'd been like 4 boys in a row. So the 3 aunties, they were growing concerned about this trajectory. And they were very pleased when the pendulum indicated a girl was coming. And they were delighted when my cousin Tara was born, for sure. So a pendulum is any tool that you use to perform dowsing that has like a thread and then an anchor at the bottom of it. What is dowsing, you ask? Well, dowsing is searching for information in the environment that's imperceptible using the 5 most common senses. And maybe you've heard of dowsing for water or like dowsing for oil. That they used to do that a lot. In fact, actually, just in my old neighborhood in Fernwood, there was an old man around the corner and he was a water witcher. And in fact, my landlord, who was otherwise like a very analytical man, like he's like a medical science researcher, author of many books. He worked at the university. He had the water witcher come over and douse for water in the backyard to try to figure out the best place to put a well. So wells and oil rigs for hundreds of years have been determined the best location for them using a dowser. We don't really know how old this skill is, but cave paintings in northwestern Africa that are like 6,000 to 8,000 years old are believed to show a water dowser at work. And we know that divining rods, and rods are another way to douse, they were used by like the Scythians and the Persians and the Medes, like very ancient cultures and civilizations talk about using them. And actually, it's only recently that we have the kind of hydraulic science to be able to detect water and oil in other ways. In fact, the US Department of the Interior Geological Survey has a pamphlet online. I'm gonna link to it in the show notes because I found it fascinating. And this pamphlet is on water dowsing. And it was published in 1917 and it's called, hang on, let me read it. It's called The Divining Rod, A History of Water Witching. And yeah, it was published in 1917 and reprinted in 1957. So like this is how the government of the US found water and oil up until very recently. So the great thing about dowsing using your pendulum is it's really easy. Anyone can do it. And it's especially to use with like yes, no, or simple multiple choice questions. It is trickier to use for locating objects or water or oil resources. It is trickier to use for locating people or pets or lost animals, that kind of thing. That takes methodical practice for sure, but you could totally take a course on it even now. So when I'm teaching the intuitive planning workshop, we use a pendulum. Many people have them, and if they don't, they will just make them. You would use a needle and thread, or in the case of my little kiddo, 1 year, they were like 7 years old, and we had gone to this Christmas craft fair, and there was a woman there making these awesome, like upcycled monsters, like one of a kind stuffies. I think it was called My Pet Monsters, and they were all made out of like brightly colored, like cashmere and wool and things like that. And my kid said, "Oh, I really want that monster." It was like the biggest one. It was so awesome. So you know how it is. It's like, "Oh, okay, we're leaving now. Oh, I just need to go to the washroom." And so then, like, made my husband create a diversion. I went back to the booth. I bought the My Pet Monster. I had to run it out to the car, come back and get my kid, get home, hide it from the kid. You know how it is when you're trying to like hide the special Christmas present. Literally later on that day, my kid comes out and goes, "Mom, I know that Santa's bringing me the monster from the craft fair." And I was like, "What? How do you know that?" They hold up a bobby pin attached to a string of dental floss. And they're like, "Because I just used the pendulum." And then we had to have a conversation about ethical use of pendulum, which is basically don't try to guess what your Christmas presents are. But anyway, it was totally cute. Anyhow, so super fun, works really well. The first thing that I teach people to do is that we need to calibrate it. So the first thing is like you ground yourself, greet the pendulum, you test it to show you yes and no and maybe. Then you make some true and false statements, like I would say, like, "My name is Frank," and see what it does. "My name is Carmen," and see what it does. And then I'd like throw it a curveball, like, "My name is Ray," which is kind of yes, kind of no, because it's my middle name. And so you're just tracking, what does the pendulum do? What movement does it make? Does it go around in a circle in one direction for yes and the opposite for no? Or maybe it swings side to side for no. Anyway, you just track what's happening. And then I also teach people how to like increase the amplitude, like make the reaction stronger if they're not getting a big movement from it. It doesn't have to be a big difference though. Like if you're just looking for a difference between yes and no, it doesn't have to be like a really dramatic difference in the motion. It just has to be perceptible to you. And then I teach about how to formulate a good question. We need like simple, clear queries for a pendulum. It's not great for super complex things, and you can only ask one question at a time. So you couldn't say like, "Will I be more relaxed and happy if I take this other job?" Because relaxed and happy is two different things. That's two different questions. So I take you through all that. Now, some of you may know about a course or remember a course I used to have called the Pendulum Primer, or maybe you've been to my intuitive planning workshops in the past 10 years. So you've seen and used pendulums, but also the pendulum charts. Now, pendulum charts make it possible to use the pendulum for much more than just simple yes and no or maybe questions. And I will get back to the pendulum primer. I'm going to teach it again in spring of 2025 as an enrichment class in the Numinous Network. But right now, like the spiritual track in the Numinous Network, we're like right in the middle of a multi-month deep dive into the tarot. But after that, stay tuned because we'll get back around to the pendulum primer. Or you could just come to the intuitive planning workshop on November 24th and you'll try it out. So that's the first tool that I use. Now, the second tool that I use, probably, a few times a year, and especially I like this one for like, kind of like life path questions, or if there's like relational questions that involve other people, this is one I like, and it's called Choosing with the Body. Though I've recently learned it could also be considered constellations. So here's what's wild. This is an exercise I've been doing for many years, since before 2014, when I first launched my year-long intuition development program, the Numinous School. Like by 2014, I had included it in that program after having done it myself for years. And I remember thinking, I feel so silly admitting this. Okay, so at the time when I like developed this process, I really thought I'd like invented it, or it had evolved, it had emerged, and it was like, oh, I have this idea, I could do this thing. And it's always been like a really big hit at my workshops, especially like in-person workshops, because in person I have folks buddy up or like go in small groups so that you can step onto these little pieces of paper and like track your body, and they will make notes for you. So your buddy would like have your journal, be writing down, taking note of like your facial expressions and how you're carrying yourself and how your energy shifts through this exercise. And then like very recently, literally like in the last 2 months, I found out, I was taught this is actually a form of constellation work. You're familiar with family constellations as a modality, or sometimes it's called variation of that, systemic constellations. This is like one of the ways that you can constellate by yourself. So for folks for whom this is like totally brand new terminology, family constellation therapy is like a short-term group intervention that just helps clients discover and address patterns and conflicts within their family groups. Or if it's called systemic constellations, it's any kind of system, not just a family system. Because any system can be constellated. You can constellate a workplace, a social issue, also like less human subjects. Like you could do a constellation for a landscape or an illness or disability. Just anything that has a systemic dimension can be constellated. And as part of my training as a constellations facilitator recently, I had this very powerful constellation related to this land that I recently moved to, and how it has echoes of like my great grandparents going through like the dirty 30s in southern Alberta and struggling on the land there. So it's a very powerful form of therapy. Constellations as a modality in like Western psychotherapy was developed by this German priest turned psychotherapist named Bert Hellinger. And he claims it was given to him by spiritual elders in a Zulu community in South Africa. I'm frankly still pretty unsettled by how the records of this sharing of information all seem pretty homogenous in their framing of this as like a very, genuine, generous gift, and that it was like very unproblematic. And I'm unsettled because we don't hear from any dissenting members of that Zulu community, and we're told like it's kind of implied or presumed that the reason it's not spoken about much is because Hellinger was likely told to hold it in a sacred way and not like overly commercialize it, and not to burden the community by over publicizing it, but also to not cheapen it. But it just, I don't know, just kind of doesn't really land for me. So I'm doing constellation work around that. And I just always said for many years, if I ever did another modality training, it would be constellation work, but I hadn't found my relationship with that yet. And I'm still exploring how to be in relationship to work that has been exploited by white supremacy culture. Especially when like so much of what we call culture in the Western world, especially in like therapeutic contexts and spiritual contexts, is appropriation. It's like so difficult to avoid it. And so where I'm at right now is just trying to amplify that aspect and be honest and still do the constellation around it. Because it does seem, okay, this is how these episodes go when I'm just ad lib. Okay, getting back to my point. My point was, even before I discovered that this was an exercise used in the constellations modality, which I do really love and admire for how it works with ancestral trauma and healing intergenerational wounds, I had already just sort of evolved this as a technique for myself out of my own intuitive exploration and been sharing it with my students, not knowing all along that this was already a thing. So I think that signals that there is an aspect to this technique that is a very primal human technology that anyone can do, and that like with left to your own devices in a spiritual exploration, you will probably come up with a version of. So when I'm doing a choosing with the body session, or a footing constellation, if you prefer that framing, the way I do it is I get no more than 5 little pieces of paper, like Post-it size. And let's say it's multiple choice. I will write no more than 4 options on the pieces of paper. And on the 5th piece of paper, I will write the words, something yet to be revealed. Because I think you should always allow something unknown or unnamed or, not yet fully formed to be an option for you here. So we don't like close out the option that whatever it is you're trying to choose between, none of them are right, So you could do it with less, but I do it with no more than 5, including something yet to be revealed. So you've written the different options on all the papers, and then you flip the papers over and you shuffle them, and then you number the backs, and then I usually shuffle blind again. And then you place those papers face down, number side up, on the floor, either in a line or I'll put it in a circle around me. And then you get really grounded. When you're ready, you step onto one of the pieces of paper and you report your sensations, emotions, any images, any thoughts that come up. You just stay for like a minute or two and you just let it evolve a little bit and try to get a sense of like, what is the gestalt? What's the feeling here? Is it comfortable for me? If not, is it uncomfortable, but in a good direction, like maybe excitement, or in a not so good direction, like contraction or freeze, that kind of thing. After a minute or two, I step off and I return to my grounded, neutral position. And I do that for each slip of paper. And I might jot down some notes. I don't usually have to because, I don't know, maybe just because if you do it long enough, it becomes really second nature. But I might jot down some notes if I'm doing this by myself. Then I go back and do like a lightning round where I'll just step on one and then I step directly from one to the other. And I decide on which one of these papers feels best. Now, when I step on, I'm not trying to like guess or interpret which option is on which slip of paper. In fact, it's best if I don't know and I don't try to guess. That's why we do it blind. We're not trying to, this isn't like a parlor trick. What we're trying to do is just get a sense of what it might feel like to choose that option, like to step onto that life path. What emotions or responses might we need to manage or deal with if we were to make that choice and follow that path? Then once I know which one I like best, I flip it over. So that gives me a sense of like, okay, what would I be saying yes to in my life if I said yes to the option on this paper? It's really, it's very fascinating, really good for feedback. Okay, next tool, the third tool that I use extensively is trancework. Of course, I've talked about trance a lot lately, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. You can just go back and listen to episode 242, Trancework Fundamentals. And that's from the Witches New Year podcast retreat series. And that is a very thorough overview of what trancework is. But just in case this is a totally brand new term for you, trancework is the umbrella term for any form of relaxed, focused state of concentration. So meditation is a form of trancework. Hypnosis is a form of trancework. Creative visualization, trancework. Guided relaxation, shamanic journeying, these are all different forms. What I want to say today about why it's so important to me to do, especially when I'm doing like annual like reorienting of my life and planning the next year, is because in the bigger picture, like at the grandest scale, I think of trancework as a form of death work. Trancework prepares us to be comfortable in altered states of consciousness, which is what the body's going to naturally do when we are close to our dying time, whether that happens slowly or suddenly. Trancework also helps us practice self-regulation when we're confronted with the unknown. Again, death, the great unknown, right? Trancework also establishes familiar and welcome allies to greet us in the unknown realms and gives us a chance to practice being in dialogue with non-human beings, which, I don't know, maybe that's not what's going to happen when we die, but if you read any of the books for death doulas, they will always talk about the bedside conversations and the period in the dying time when the dying person is receiving visitation. So it would be great to not be like taken off guard by that or become afraid of that. I also think of it like, I think of trance work as like learning the language of a country you're going to visit or relocate to. Like, it's just a common sense thing to do so you get more oriented more easily once you arrive. So death work for me, just in my life, it's not my calling to be like a death doula or do bedside singing or anything like that. But I do feel like it's part of my practice of being current in my life, is like facing my mortality. And again, if you listen for a long time, you know I spent a year in therapy with a therapist who also happened to be a Stoic philosopher, and that was very helpful for me. And the Stoics are very much about that, right? Memento mori, like remember that you too will die. I think for my annual like planning, it's kind of like the perfect time to just go ahead and like do my intentional death work practice. So anyway, trance work at any time for me is a form of death work practice, and especially when I'm doing planning that's orienting my life around kind of the big picture of what I'm doing here on this planet, it only makes sense to include it. So for myself, when I do annual trance work to connect for planning, I connect with 3 individual guides in particular. And this is the same trios of trance work journeys that I guide others through at my annual intuitive planning workshop. So the first trance journey, I meet with a wise guide. For you, that could be anyone. That could be a great salmon that you talk to, or it could be an ancestor, grandfather. For me, this is a crone figure, maybe an ancestor, or maybe some version of the Cailleach, the old woman of winter in Scottish and Irish folklore. She's, I meet her every year. She's kind of a no bullshit granny type, and she just tells me how it is and also how I am, like how I'm doing, if I've got my priorities straight, all that kind of stuff. So my wise guide takes me on a bit of a life tour for the year ahead. For the second journey, I'm connecting with a champion. And this champion is so important because they are my daemon. They understand my virtue and my purpose, and they direct me towards actions that align with my fate. And this concept of a daemon, it's like a little bit like a guardian angel in a way, but like not religious. So the concept of a daemon who orients you towards your fate comes from ancient Hellenism, the ancient Greeks. Your daemon was the special good spirit that looked over you and your household and granted you protection and was the giver of good fortune and increase. So to cultivate virtue, one might call upon their daemon, this good spirit of destiny. Now, to the ancient Greeks, virtue was something very specific and very essential. Virtue, arete, meant to develop one's character or to fully realize one's potential or one's inherent function, and then to perform one's inherent function excellently. So it's a similar thing to the notion of amor fati, love of one's fate, but this one really mobilizes it into action, that it's a practice that you do. You try to accept your fate and do it excellently. And to the ancients, you were born with gifts from the gods, and your job was to develop those gifts into talents. A gift developed becomes a talent. So in a way, it's about being really talented at living out your own fate fully. It's the talent of walking your unique path in life. So in this belief system, the gods considered virtue, this embrace of your unique path and walking it well, they considered virtue one of the most important values, and that cultivating it would lead to happiness and abundance and prosperity and good health and long life. Now, of course, the Christian church, they like took hold of this idea of the daemon, and they did what they do. You know, in monotheism, you can't have like a lot of mediating beings between humans and the one true God, right? You can't have many gods and, you know, demigods and things like that. So they demoted and villainized the daemon to become the demon. So this type of personal guardian and tutelary spirit became a scary thing not to be engaged with. So, as always, in my work, we are peeling back the layers of patriarchy, and we are cleansing this like wonderful spiritual birthright, cleansing it of like all the fear and all the isolation and all the shame. And we are reclaiming our good spirit of destiny and celebrating that we have a road to walk in this life. And you know what? It's probably a humble one. And yet it is a good and honorable and even valiant thing and a joyful thing to perform our fateful function excellently and walk our road with a hearty embrace. So I love connecting with my champion, and my champion essentially gives me or orients me towards my next set of life instructions. Then the third journey I take is to meet with my nurturing healer. And for me, this is like a motherly figure who cares for me in a way that I don't receive very often on the earth plane. And she's also like an energy worker who can remove all the gunk I've accumulated over the course of the year. She spiritually cleanses and purifies me. She gives me whatever I'm missing in terms of contact nutrition and spiritual sustenance. And she restores my energy, like she gives me a boost. She's like the best body worker I could ever hope for, right? And she helps me prep for the year ahead by filling my reserves and pumping me up with like the specific kind of energy I'm going to need to move through the world and through my work and to show up in relationships in the way that I want and the way that my people need and the way that's aligned with my virtue. And she often helps me release, you know, I usually have like a really good cry. And she also helps me regulate. You know, I usually feel deeply restored afterwards. So my healer gives me the strength to do what I need to do to have the life that I want. Now, of course, I can totally meet with these spirit allies anytime, like anytime I want or need. And I do trance work all the time for this purpose. But, you know, I'm a busy lady. I don't always have the time and the space to connect for like big, long trance journeys. So, like during the rest of the year, it's often like stopping by for a quick oil change. Or, like, if you want a more relaxing metaphor, I'm usually like just getting a quick manicure. Whereas this intuitive planning workshop, my annual planning for the year ahead, that's more like taking the car into the shop for a tune-up or like having a half day at the spa for massage, facial, mani-pedi, and a nice lunch, you know? So my pendulum's helping me with like quick yes, no, or simple multiple choice type decisions. Choosing with the body or constellating is helping me with more complex problems that I might have a lot of subconscious feelings about. And the trancework journeys are time for me to receive. I receive advice, I receive witnessing and resourcing from my guides. And then after all that, it's time to put together an action plan. And this is where the oracular calendar comes in. And it's like the main act. It's so great. Now, because I'm an entrepreneur who loves marketing, I love a nice editorial calendar. And even if I'm like not particularly following it through the year because something happens or I decide to pivot or I just get tired, I still love having a grasp of the year's overall themes, like a sense of the vibe as I move through the months. So if I know I'm going to want to focus on marketing and my business in the year ahead, I'll do a separate year ahead reading just to get the themes and topics I might be focusing on in my messaging each month, or just some advice about like my tone, you know? And so some years I'm really focused on that. But other years, like this one coming up, I don't have the energy. I don't have the brain glucose handy for like a whole extra editorial calendar. You know what I mean? So this year, I'm going to like stay within my perimenopausal cognitive capacity. And I'm just going to have my one calendar with the themes that I should anticipate for the coming year. Now, to do this year ahead reading, you can use just one deck, and it can be either an oracle deck or a tarot deck, whichever you're most comfortable with. But for my annual intuitive workshops, I take all my favorite decks and I spread them out face down on the floor, and then I mix them all up together. I swirl them and I mix them all up. And when I would do these for in-person workshops, I would mix like 50 or more decks together. I have a pretty large collection of oracle and tarot decks, I guess. I interview a lot of decks and I keep the ones that I really like and I give the other ones away. So I think at most at any one time that I've had, I think I've had like maybe hovering just over 100 decks at one point. But now I think I'm at like more of a reasonable number, which for me is like 50. So anyway, of the 50 that I kind of like and I'm keeping around, I will choose the 6 to 10 decks that are really speaking to me. And as I said, I put them all down and I mix them all up so that they're like a well of images. And so then I guide people through a process to like ground and select their 12 cards for the year, and the process for like how to interpret them as a whole and then individually. And then we start scheduling. And for the scheduling, I suggest a very specific order. First of all, I suggest you do existing commitments. And these are the like immovable objects in your calendar. The things that are plugged in first are the things that you don't have any wiggle room on, right? So I put my immovable commitments into the calendar first. And when I say calendar, it's like I've got all my cards out. I usually use like sticky tack and I put the cards from the reading on the wall, and then I have Post-its in different colors. So the existing commitments are one color and I write them down. Like I'm like, yep, every year I do intuitive business planning, and that's going to be in November. It's like, okay, I write intuitive business planning workshop and pop that Post-it under November. It's not really going to be at any other time. Then I look at the 12 cards in the reading and I note where any difficult looking cards are. And I will write vacation, and I put vacation with the difficult cards because I'm trying to make as much space in my calendar as possible for this challenging time. I think of it as like scheduled breakdowns. Like that's going to be a tough time. Maybe I might have something that I have to do, but I won't put a bunch of like extras that month because clearly I'm going to be going through it. Then I look for all the like really good energy cards. And if I can find some that are like particularly captivating or like lifting my energy, then I'm going to prioritize playtime, restorative time, romance, vacations that are more like getaways or adventures. I think of those as like scheduled upgrades or moments of resting in states of well-being that I'll want to extend and like also make space around if I can. And then I also look for like, where is the most generative energy? If I want to have like a new initiative or there's like productivity that I'm trying to get around to, some creative work I want to bring forth, I'm looking for, is there a card or two that has the most like generative energy? So I think of those as opportunistic moments. If I don't have something already in mind, I just like make a note of that as like save space. Don't fill up that month too much because I may have a stroke of inspiration and want somewhere to put it. So I have a number of suggestions for like how to keep your calendar front and center throughout the year. But for that, you'll just have to join us at the workshop where we get more granular and more detailed. So my 10th annual intuitive planning workshop is happening on Sunday, November 24th, 2024, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific. So November 24th, all day. I used to offer it mainly to entrepreneurs, and I called it my intuitive business planning workshop. IBP workshop for short. But then like so many other people wanted to come and they felt like they were missing out on something useful, and they were. So I opened it up to everyone. because it is useful and it's lots of fun. And it's a great way to pause and reflect and attune and make space for discernment and divination before we mobilize for the energy of the coming year. So to join us for that, you simply sign up for the Numinous Network. It's a monthly subscription, but you're totally welcome to just stay for 1 month, and there's no high pressure to stay. In fact, we remind you, hey, if you wanted to cancel, it's time to cancel, So even if you just attend the 1 day-long workshop, it's still an awesome deal. It's still a great value. But I feel like you'll probably want to stick around for at least another month, because December 1st, we're kicking off Yuletide. And this year, my annual Yuletide program will be a free Numinous Network podcast mini-series again. So if you enjoyed Witch's New Year, that retreat mini-series, I think you're going to love the Spirit of Yuletide, because there will be 12 podcast episodes coming about the spirit and magic of the Yuletide season. There'll be one published each day from December 21st to January 1st. But each one has an accompanying guided daily meditation, and that is only going to be found in the Numinous Network. So all of the guided daily meditations for those 12 days, as well as daily live gathering for altar time, and also like all the other earlier things that happen in the month, I think of it as like Yuletide pre-gaming, It's like in the beginning of December, we have these seasonal events to get us into the spirit and also manage our energy. And those all only happen in the Numinous Network. So things like December 1st, grounding the season. It's our session where we get centered and clear in our values and our priorities, like sidebar, anti-capitalist values, attachment priorities, before the hectic festivities begin. And then we have other seasonal events, like we always have a ritual crafting session together. We have a winter solstice ritual. We also hold a candlelight vigil for the beloved dead on December 30th every year. So these are all live gatherings, but again, they're all recorded and they'll be included in your monthly membership. Now, as I look ahead to programming for 2025, I think you'll want to know, some of you will want to know, 2 things that I know for sure are happening. So number 1, my new book, Spells for the Apocalypse, is in stores on January 14th. And every month in the Numinous Network in 2025, I'll be hosting a new moon ritual and a full moon ritual directly from that book, Spells for the Apocalypse. And number 2, the other thing in 2025 with programming is I'm leading monthly constellation workshops in the Numinous Network. So very cool things. And one of our longtime members said to me not long ago that the Numinous Network is like a cross between the YMCA and the library. So like you wouldn't join the Y and take every single class. You wouldn't join the library expecting to read every single book. You join because there's something you can get there that's helpful and like wholesome and has kind of an anti-capitalist attitude and is inclusive. And the people are going to be down to earth and kind. And you're going to get a lot of support and a lot of value at the lowest possible cost. Now, I do have to tell you, this is the special announcement. There will be a price increase for new memberships starting on January 1st. If you're already a member before then, you'll get this. You'll stay at your old plan. But there will be a price increase for the Numinous Network on January 1st, 2025. It'll be a small amount at the lower end of the pay what you can tier and more for the upper end. And this is because like every single software or service product that I've used to run the network has increased my monthly fees over the past few years. The most dramatic cost increase is with the Safe and Sound protocol, which is a polyvagal-based music listening program that's included with membership. And after hemming and hawing and trying to figure out like how to absorb this, they kind of front-end loaded these cost increases, I decided that instead of charging extra for the SSP, I would just make it a bit more like the insurance industry model. I mean, I hate insurance, but the model where everybody pays a little, and like mostly people don't use it, but some people are going to use it a lot, and they're going to be heavier users. But it's going to be fine. It's all going to work out because it all evens out in the end. We all just pay in a little, and then we know it's there for us when we need it. So right now, the minimum you can pay for membership in the Numinous Network is $45 US a month, depending on your identities. That would be like your situation, your identities or your income. But on January 1st, the minimum level is going to go up to $50 US. So this is like 6 weeks notice. I am so sorry. I hate to do it, but the margins keep thinning and I keep adding more guides and programming, and I got to even things out somehow. Anyway, if you want to leave me some feedback or you have a question for me, you can go to the show notes in your podcast player at numinouspodcast.com. And there you'll find a link to leave a voicemail or a written note for me. Or you can go to castfeedback.com/numinouspodcast and find it there. And please don't hesitate. I love your notes. In fact, listener shout out to Boom Boom Baby. Here's a note from Boom Boom Baby, who wrote in my feedback inbox, I love your show and have wanted to join your network for a long time, but I've had bad experiences with what I've heard you call white lady spirituality circles. I didn't coin that term, actually. Sidebar, Boom Boom Baby. That was Rachel Rice, I think. I can link to that blog post in the show notes. Anyway, back to you. Okay, I am in recovery from long-time substance abuse, semi-sober, and I find I can be quite triggered by how much spiritual bypassing and casual drug and alcohol use can be an expected part of these spaces. Do you have a policy on that? I don't see anything on your website. That is a great question, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. I just quite directly, I don't have a policy specifically about mentioning drug and alcohol use. So at present, I do not have a written policy on what you're describing. What we do have is a very structured environment with a very clear guideline for trauma-sensitive posting. And we've set it up and structured the network so it has a minimal feed. What I mean by that is it's not like Facebook or Instagram where you have a feed and people can just post random posts musing about whatever is up for them right now. Only very specific people can post, except in our chat, which is, again, has very specific guidelines. And we have a very clear and specific posting policy when it comes to that chat around not sharing details of trauma. So we will share trigger warnings and content warnings, but we won't share details about it. We ask people to lead with their need or lead with where they're stuck and be very specific about that need. They either need compassionate validation or advice or resources, like links to things. So very often what people are posting is like, they want a candle to be lit or names to be placed on the altar or prayers to be spoken or people to hold them in the light because something stressful is happening. And then we have certain live events where there's a little bit more support for people who might want to share. And that's in a very specific, invited, and like quite choreographed container. It's not just like open circles. So we'll have structured sharing, and then a qualified guide can support anyone who's dysregulated with what we call our safety check process. So we're very highly structured because structure is the correlate to safe touch and containment, which are so important for us to be able to settle our nervous system. So we are teaching folks how to calm their inner signal cry so they don't just speak like a flood of stuff. And also we're teaching people how to receive care that is beyond verbal processing. It's kind of a lot to explain in a little question like this, but what I'd suggest for you, Boom Boom, is that you try us out. Maybe you wait until free week. The next free week will likely be in March. I mean, you could try it any time. But when you come in, you would start by watching the on-demand videos in my course, Contact Nutrition 101. That will give you a really good idea of the foundational knowledge we're building on and putting into practice when we say we're holding a trauma-sensitive space. And in the meantime, I'm going to put some thought into this. So again, thank you for bringing it forward. I'll bring it to my team of network guides for peer supervision and get their input. I will also say, though, it feels like a good sign. It's very timely that you bring it up because in the new year, we will be launching a new monthly session called Soft Sober Jams, and it's going to be hosted by Amelia Symington Fetty. who you may have heard on this show, episode 229, What It Feels Like a Girl. She's also the author of Skid Dogs, an excellent coming-of-age memoir, kind of like Stand By Me, but for girls in the 90s. And these sessions are going to be non-dogmatic, attachment theory-based groups for folks who are trying out sobriety or maybe long-timers. You won't be sold any merch. It's not an accountability process. It's just mutual self-help and support and some witnessing with like a good dose of contact nutrition. And that's also going to be starting, as I said, early spring, probably March. So maybe we'll see you then, if not sooner. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that question. Thank you for all being here and listening. You can check out the live schedule for the Numinous Network and learn more at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.